Hello and welcome. I am glad you are here, wherever here happens to be. Perhaps you are in a bed with the covers pulled up around you. Perhaps you are on a couch and a blanket has wrapped itself around your legs. Perhaps you are in the dark or in the soft, dim glow of a lamp turned down low, and the house has finally gone quiet around you, the way houses do when the evening has worn itself out. If you are still awake, I want you to take a long, slow breath. Let it out through your mouth, like a small, private sigh. Close your eyes for just a moment, if that is comfortable. And know that there is no need to keep up with me. There is no test at the end of the story, no quiz about dates and names, no holding your breath. What I have to tell you tonight moves at the pace of a nighttime candle, and it is perfectly okay if you drift in and out of it like a boat tied loosely to a dock. Tonight, I want to take you to a city that used to be called Constantinople, and before that Byzantium, and which the people who lived there during our story called Istanbul, a name with a wonderful round sound, as if the syllables were meant to be said with a full mouth just before sleep. It was one of the great cities of the world, sitting at the edge where Europe and Asia almost touch, where seawater slips under old stone walls, and the skyline is made of domes and minarets, rising one after another like waves of a sea that has been stilled. It was a city of hills and markets and wooden houses, of chimneys that let out the smoke of 10,000 households at once, of streets so narrow in places that you could lean out of a window and almost shake hands with your neighbor across the way. It was loud during the day, loud with the voices of vendors and the braying of donkeys, with the calls from the shipyards and the creak of wagons, with the din of dogs and the crying of gulls overhead. But our story takes place at night, when the humming had finally stopped, and the city lay down across its hills like a great animal settling into the earth. The streets were dark mostly, with only an occasional lantern burning near a gate or a guard post, the kind of small flame that seems to make the darkness around it feel deeper rather than shallower. You know that feeling, how a single lamp in a long street can be less like company and more like a wave of solitude. That kind. The dogs would bark, because in that city there were always dogs, roaming in great loose tribes, and eventually they would settle down too, curling up in the middle of the cobblestones, their heads on their paws, their breath turning to mist in the cold air. The water would slap against the sea walls, low and patient, a sound like the city gently swallowing, and then releasing, then swallowing again. And on the ridges of the city, in the upper neighborhoods, along the slopes that gathered the evening wind, there stood great buildings made to hold very many bodies together under one roof. These were the barracks. We are going to go inside one of them, but slowly. We will not rush the door. We will let the night outside stay with us for a little longer, so that we can feel the difference when we step under the eaves of the soldiers' house. The soldiers, I mean, were the Janissaries. You may have heard of them. They are among the most famous fighting forces in all of history, and their name carries a weight of discipline and loyalty, and sometimes trouble. The word itself comes from the Turkish Janissary, which means new soldier or new troop. And that word is the first clue to the strange truth at the heart of their story. They were not born into the job. They were not the sons of soldiers, not a family trade handed down from father to son. They were brought into it. They were taken into it. And that is where our story begins, not in a battle, not in a parade, but in the quiet, frightened, wide-awake hours of a boy's first night among strangers. Let us travel to a village, since we must know where the boy came from. Imagine a small settlement at the edge of a forest, somewhere in the hills of the Balkans, far from the glittering capital. It is a place of mud walls and low roofs, of smoke rising in thin blue threads from holes in the thatch, of a stream running cold over stones, and fields that have been worked by the same families for as long as memory. There is a church, small and whitewashed, with a bell that rings out the hours and the seasons. The people keep sheep and goats and a few dull, patient oxen. They grow wheat and beans, and in the autumn they press apples for a sour, sharp cider that the old men drink by the fire while telling the same stories they told last winter and the winter before. It is a world that has its own kind of beauty, modest and repetitive, the sort of beauty that you only learn to love after living in it for years, and that a child takes for granted the way a fish takes for granted the water. Now, let me pause here, because the system that brought a boy out of a village like this into the barracks of Istanbul is a hard thing, and I do not want to slip by it as if it were nothing. History is full of hard things, and the honest thing to do is to acknowledge them, then hold them carefully, the way you would hold a stone that is still warm from the sun after the day has gone dark. The Ottoman Empire, in the years of its long rule, collected some of its soldiers from a practice called the devshirme, which means, roughly, gathering or collecting. Every so often, not every year, not in every village, but often enough that the memory of it sat heavy in the countryside, an official would ride into a place like the one I have described. He would come with papers and soldiers and a list, and the village would go quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of waiting. The devshirme was a levy of boys, Christian boys from the Orthodox communities of the Balkans and Anatolia, were chosen for the Sultan's service. They were brought to the capital, converted to the religion of the empire, taught the Turkish language and the arts of war, and raised to serve in the palace or in the Janissary Corps. It is complicated to talk about, because on the one hand, it was an enormous, life-altering loss for the families who had to give up their children, and on the other hand it was, for many of the boys themselves, a path upward in the world, a way out of a life of poverty and endless labor, a route to power and wealth that would have been impossible for them at home. Both of those things can be true at once, and history is full of such contradictions. I mention it only because a story about a boy who cannot sleep in the barracks is really a story about a boy who has lost his old bed and is trying to find a new one. And the shape of that loss is part of why he lies awake with his eyes open in the darkness. But we do not need to dwell on the heaviness. Let us instead follow the boy himself, because he is not a mule carrying a burden of meaning. He is a boy, maybe 11 years old, maybe 12, with a face that has not yet grown into its own features, and hands that are still soft at the palms. We will call him Marco, though that was not what he would be called for much longer. In the village, he knew himself by the name his mother called from the garden, the name his father shouted when the cows strayed, the name the priest used when teaching him his letters. Marco, it is a good, plain name, and he would lose it soon enough, replaced by an Ottoman name, a Turkish name, a name that would fit in the ranks and on the muster rolls. But for tonight, on his first night in the barracks, he is still, in his own mind, Marco. He was collected in the autumn. I like to think it was autumn, though it could have been spring. The officials did not consult the mothers when they chose their dates. But let us have autumn, because the air in the story will feel cleaner, and because traveling is easier when it is cold, and you are too tired to be afraid. Marco was brought to the provincial town, and from there he was gathered with other boys, some like him, some younger, some older, all of them quiet in the way of children who have been told to be quiet and cannot remember why they are obeying. They walked a great deal. The roads of the empire were good roads for their time, paved in places with the stones of older roads, Roman stones, and the boys' feet grew hard, and their shoes wore thin. They saw mountains and rivers, and the great plain that spread out before the walls of the city. They stopped at villages and at small caravanserais, where the travelers slept on shelves of stone, wrapped in their own cloaks, and the smoke from the central fire curled up through a hole in the roof, and the boys lay together, without saying much, listening to the breathing of strangers. By the time they reached Istanbul, Marco had lost the name of his village. Not that it had been taken from him by force. It had simply been worn away by miles, and by the slow erasure of a child who stops being asked about home and starts being told about the future. They crossed water to enter the city. There is always water around Istanbul, and on a clear day, it gleams like a knife laid flat on blue cloth. Marco saw the great walls, higher than anything he had ever imagined, with their towers and their gates and their long memory of sieges, and he was too tired to be impressed. He was hungry, and his feet were blistered inside his shoes, and he wanted very much to lie down somewhere flat and dark, and not be woken until the world had become something he understood again. And so we come, at last, to the barracks. The Janissaries did not always have permanent barracks in the way we might picture a modern army base. In the early centuries, they were lodged in various places, in old palaces, in converted churches, in great warehouses near the port. But by the time of our story, there were purpose-built quarters in the city, great compounds that stood around open courtyards, with kitchens and bathhouses and storerooms. And most importantly, the sleeping halls where hundreds upon hundreds of men and boys made their beds every night. There was a famous marching song about the barracks, about the smell of the soup and the sound of the oda, but you do not need to know it. You only need to see the building as Marco saw it when he arrived, in the late afternoon, with the light turning gold and then gray. The compound was built as a series of long, low buildings around a courtyard, paved with stones that had been worn smooth by 100 years of boots and bare feet and hands washing and water spilling. There was a fountain in the middle of the courtyard, because water was precious, and a great tree in one corner, and a row of chimneys rising from the kitchen wing. The whole place smelled of wood smoke and boiling meat, and the particular odor of a large number of men living close together. The wool and sweat and rawhide of soldiers, the sharp tang of lye soap, the sour note of things that have been damp and are drying slowly. It was not an unpleasant smell, exactly, but it was overwhelming to a boy who had grown up with the clean air of the hills and the soft, faint smell of hay and cattle. Marco stood in the courtyard with the other new boys, and he breathed shallowly, and he felt the weight of the building pressing down on him like a hand placed flat on his head. The building we are interested in is the Oda, the room. The whole corps was organized into companies, and each company had its own quarters, called simply a room, though there was nothing simple about it. A great hall-like space, the Oda could hold 100 or 200 men, all eating, sleeping, and living together in one vast common chamber. Think of the largest room you have ever been in, and then imagine that room with the beds brought in and the dining tables moved out, and hundreds of cots and wool mats laid along the floor and up onto low wooden platforms that ran along the walls. That was the Oda. At one end, there was a raised dais for the commander of the company, the Sorbisai, a name that we will come back to because it has to do with soup, and soup is important. At the other end, near the door, there were the ranks of the ordinary soldiers, the men and the boys, arranged in an order that was older and stricter than any written rule. Now, I want to speak a little about the word Sorbisai, because it is one of the small, strange details of history that can keep a mind pleasantly occupied as it drifts toward sleep. The Sorbisai was the officer in charge of a company, and his title meant, literally, soup maker or soup man, from Sorba, the soup that was the lifeblood of the Janissary Corps. The soldiers cooked their food in huge bronze cauldrons, great round-bellied pots that they carried with them on campaign. And those cauldrons were not just cookware, they were symbols of the unit, almost sacred objects. The company's soup was its honor, and the Sorbisai was the man who stood beside the cauldron and made sure the soup was distributed fairly, which made him the natural leader of the company. So when Marco was told to obey the Sorbisai, he was being told to obey a man whose authority came from a pot of soup. History is full of such quiet, funny truths if you look for them. And there is something deeply comforting, I think, in the idea of an army officer whose title is Soup Man, a title that makes you want to wrap yourself in a blanket and listen to the soft bubbles of a broth cooking over the coals. But Marco did not know where to eat that first evening. He was an assemi, a novice, a recruit, which meant he was not yet part of the full company. He was in the Asemi Akagi, the house of the novices, attached to the barracks, but a little apart, like a separate wing of a single house. There were other Asemi boys with him, gathered from the same levy, all of them new to the city, all of them trying to learn the rhythm of this strange new life. Their sleeping quarters were simpler than the main Oda, but not by much. A long, low hall with a raised wooden platform running along the wall on either side, and a narrow aisle down the middle, and a hearth at one end. On the wooden platforms, each boy had a space about the width of his own body, and that space was his bed, his own territory, his small claim on the floor of the world. Let me describe the bed itself, because a bed is the center of any story about sleep. The bed was not a mattress on a frame, not the soft, deep nest that you are lying in right now, perhaps, with the sheets smooth and the pillow cool under your cheek. No, each boy was given a felt pad, a mattress made of thick, dense wool felt, called a keese, and a simple blanket, and sometimes a small coarse cushion that served as a pillow. The felt pad was laid directly on the wooden platform, and its job was to separate the body from the hard boards and from the cold that crept up through them in the night. It was not a very soft job. The felt was stiff and smelled strongly of sheep, of lanolin and earth and the animal that had given its wool, and it would soften over time as the boy's body warmed it and pressed it down. But on the first night, it felt like lying on the back of a sleeping animal, hard and warm and slightly alive. And each boy had a place. The places were assigned, or they were chosen, depending on the year and the fortune of the recruit. But in the Asemi Akagi, the rule was that the older boys, the ones who had been there for years, took the places near the hearth, where the warmth of the fire could reach them through the night. The new boys, the ones fresh from the levee, were given places farther from the fire, closer to the door, where the draft came in under the sill, and the air was cold enough to form a small cloud around your face when you breathed. It was not a punishment. It was simply the way of things, the old order of the world, where the young serve the old and the cold is a lesson taught quietly to the skin. Now, let us walk through the evening that Marco spent before his first night, because the body prepares for sleep through ritual, and the ritual here was strange to him, and the strangeness was part of why he could not drift off. The evening meal came first. In the Janissary tradition, the meal was simple and communal. There was soup, of course, bread and soup, and sometimes a thin stew of mutton, and a kind of wheat pilaf, and water. The boys ate from wooden bowls, sitting cross-legged along the aisle of the hall, their bowls held close to their chests, their spoons made of wood and worn smooth by the mouths of dozens of boys before them. There was no talking during the meal, or very little. An older soldier, a Kazan Agassi, the master of the cauldron, ladled the soup from a huge iron pot set beside the hearth, and the steam rose in a great white plume, carrying the smell of lamb and rotted onion and salt. And for a moment, the hall was filled with the quiet clink of spoons and the soft, animal sound of hungry boys eating fast. There was a strange custom in the Janissary barracks that I love, and it has to do with the cauldron. The great bronze cauldron, the kazan, was kept in a special place, and when the soldiers wanted to make a complaint or show their displeasure, they would turn the cauldron upside down. To turn the kazan over was to say, publicly, that there would be no soup tonight, that the bond between the soldier and his commanders had been broken. It was a gesture of protest, a way of saying, "We will not eat your soup because you have broken your side of the bargain." Marco did not know this on his first evening. He only knew that the old soldiers kept glancing at the cauldron with a kind of respect, and that when the meal was over, the cauldron was washed and polished and covered with a cloth, as if it were a sleeping thing that should not be disturbed. After the meal, there was prayer. The boys who had already been educated in the new faith performed the evening prayer together, and Marco, who was still learning, stood at the back of the room and watched, and tried to follow the movements, the raising of the hands, the bow, the prostration, the small, still moments in between. He did not know the words yet, and so he stood in silence with his arms at his sides, and he let the sounds wash over him like water over a stone. The prayer was followed by a kind of inspection. The Otobashi, the head of the room, walked slowly down the aisle between the platforms, checking that each boy's bed was tidy, that the blanket was folded, that the felt pad was laid straight. He stopped in front of Marco and looked at him for a long moment, and then he said something that Marco did not understand, and Marco felt the heat rise in his face. And then the Otobashi reached down and adjusted the blanket, folding it exactly in half, and moved on. It was not punishment. It was simply teaching. But Marco's face stayed hot for a long time afterward. And then the lamps were lowered. In those days, before gaslight and electricity, the night was far darker than anything you have likely experienced, unless you have camped deep in the wilderness and watched the stars come out without a single artificial light to blur them. The oil lamps in the Asemi Akagi were turned down, not out. A single small flame was left burning near the door, a night light that cast long, shaky shadows across the room. The boys took their places on their felt pads. They lay down on their sides, facing the wall, because that was the rule, or possibly just the habit, and they pulled their blankets up over their ears. Marco lay on his back, because he did not know the custom yet, and he stared at the dark beams of the ceiling, and he listened. This is what he heard: the crackle of the hearth, where a few embers still glowed under the ash, the slow, careful footsteps of the Otobashi, walking the perimeter of the room one last time, the sound of the other boys breathing, some of them already asleep, their breath coming in long, slow waves that rose and fell like the tide against the sea walls outside. A boy a few platforms away was snoring, a low, steady rumble that sounded, Marco thought, like a cart rolling over a wooden bridge. Another boy was talking in his sleep, mumbling words in a language that Marco did not know, words that might have been a prayer, or the name of a mother, or a plea to be brought home, all mixed together in the slurry of dreaming. And beneath all of that, there was the wind, moving through the gaps in the window frames, a sound like something very large and very patient breathing, in and out, in and out. Marco lay there, and his body was exhausted. It had been a day of walking, of waiting, of being shuffled from one official to another, of standing in the courtyard, of eating, of being afraid. His legs ached the deep ache of a child who has walked farther than he has ever walked before. His stomach felt hollow, not with hunger he had eaten, but with the particular emptiness of being far from home. His eyes were dry, and his head was full of a low, buzzing tiredness, the kind that should carry you to sleep within moments of lying down. And yet he could not sleep. His mind would not stop its small, worried circling. It kept returning to his mother's face, to the strange, hollow look she had worn when they had come for him, to the way his father had stood with his hands at his sides, not moving, not speaking, as if the ground had swallowed his voice. It kept returning to the village, to the stream, to the sound of the sheep bells in the evening, to the shape of the roof beams of his own house, which he would never see again. And at the same time, his body was learning. Already, without his mind telling it to, his body was responding to the rhythm of the room. The warmth of the other boys, a kind of gentle heat radiating from every sleeping shape on the platform, had begun to seep into his felt pad. The wool smelled of sheep, of home, of the hills, faintly, under the odor of smoke and men. There was that clean animal smell, and it made his chest ache with a tenderness he could not name. The snoring had become steadier, almost musical, less like a cart, and more like a low, rough lullaby. The wind had settled. The embers had faded until the only light was the small, steady flame near the door, which threw a single warm glow onto the ceiling like a tiny, unmoving moon. Marco felt his eyes growing heavy, not because he had decided to sleep, but because his body had decided for him, and the decision was being made slowly, the way the tide decides to cover a sandbar, inch by inch. He turned onto his side, facing the wall, the way the others had positioned themselves. The blanket was too thin, but the felt pad was warm now, warmed by his own body, and the warmth folded around him like a hand. He closed his eyes, and the world behind his eyelids was a red and gold dark, full of the shapes of the day, and the day began to loosen its grip on him. He did not fall asleep all at once. He fell asleep in stages, the way a river falls into the sea, gradually, and then all at once, and then gradually again. In one moment, he was aware of the boy next to him, the slow rhythm of that boy's breath. In the next moment, the breath had become part of his own, and the room had become part of the world, and the world had become part of something older and softer. And then, at last, the night folded him in. But before that, and just at the edge of sleep, Marco heard something that he would remember for the rest of his life. It was a voice, small and clear, coming from somewhere at the other end of the room. A boy younger than him had begun to cry, not the loud crying of a child who is hurt, but the quiet, hopeless crying of a child who is trying very hard not to be heard and is failing. The sound was muffled, pressed into a sleeve or a blanket, but it was unmistakable. Marco heard it, and he heard the Otobashi moving through the dark with a lantern now dimmed almost to black. And he heard the low, soft voice of the Otobashi speaking to the crying boy, not harshly, not angrily, but gently, a few words in a language that the boy might not have understood, followed by silence, followed by the sound of the Otobashi kneeling down, and perhaps laying a hand on the boy's shoulder. And then the crying stopped, and the room was quiet again, and Marco, with the last thread of his awareness, felt something loosen in his chest. He slept. He slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a child who has been carried to the limits of his endurance, and then gently set down. The night passed over the barracks like a slow, dark wing. The flame near the door burned down and was replaced by another. Otobashi made his rounds on the hour in the silence. The wind picked up and then dropped again. The sea slapped against the sea walls, patient and endless. And in the morning, long before the light, there was a call to prayer, and the barracks stirred, and Marco opened his eyes, not remembering where he was, for one long, blessed moment, until the smell of smoke and wool and the sound of 100 bodies stretching brought it all back, and he turned his face into his pillow and let the new day find him slowly. And that is where we will leave him, for now, in the half-light of his first morning as a recruit. Because there is more, so much more to this story, and we are in no hurry to reach it. There are the rules of the barracks, the strange, small customs that governed everything from the way a boy folded his blanket to the place where he was allowed to stand in the line. There is the matter of the baths, and the weekly cleaning, and the long afternoons of training. There is the story of the drummer boys, and the mystery of the coffee, and the long, slow process by which a boy from a village in the hills became, over years and years, a janissary, a new soldier, a man with a cauldron and a place to sleep. But those are stories for another night, when the candles are low and you are ready to be carried away again. For now, let us stay here in the quiet that follows sleep, in the moment when the barracks hold their breath between the dark and the dawn. If you are still awake, I want you to notice the weight of your own covers, the warmth of your own pillow, the small, ordinary miracle of lying in a bed that you know, in a house that knows you. And if you have already drifted off, then you have done exactly what you were supposed to do. Let the story go. It will be waiting for you, patient as a lantern, when you come back. Good night, and sleep well. And yet, perhaps you are still awake. Perhaps you are one of those listeners who finds it hard to let go at the end of a story, who keeps one eye open, listening, hoping that the narrator might come back just once more. I understand that feeling. I have that feeling myself many nights when the house is still and the clock on the stairs has stopped its ticking and the whole world seems to be waiting for one more sentence, one more breath, one more small revelation. So let us not say good night just yet. Let us stay together a little longer, you and I, in the dark. Let us drift back to that barracks, to that great wooden room by the sea, to Marco, who is waking up to his first full day. He wakes before the light. That is the thing about the barracks. There is always someone who wakes earlier than you do, and then another, and then a chain of wakings that runs through the room like a ripple in still water. Marco opens his eyes to the sound of a bell, or rather to the sound of a wooden clapper, a sharp, dry sound like a goat's foot on a rock. And before he knows what he is doing, he is standing on the platform with his blanket in his hands, because everyone else is standing, and so he stands too. Some of the boys are faster than him. Some of them have already folded their blankets into neat, tight rolls, the kind that look like loaves of bread, and they are waiting with their hands at their sides. Marco folds his blanket as best he can. It is not neat. It is a lumpy thing, a roll that looks more like a sleeping cat than a loaf of bread. But no one hits him, no one yells at him, and he decides that this is a good sign. The windows are still dark. There is a single lantern burning at the far end of the room, and by its light, Marco can see the bodies of the other boys moving in silhouette, dressing, folding, stretching, rubbing their eyes. Some of them are very small. There are boys here who cannot be older than 8, boys whose heads barely reach the shoulder of the boy next to them, boys who look like they have been carved out of driftwood, thin and pale, and all angles. Marco looks at them and feels something shift in his chest, a strange mixture of pity and relief. He is not the smallest. He is not the only one whose eyes are red from homesickness. The boy next to him, the one who had been crying in the night, is standing very still, his face blank, as if the crying had never happened. Marco catches his eye and does not smile, because smiling feels wrong, but he nods, a small, quick nod, the kind of nod that says, "I see you. I will not say anything." The boy nods back, and then the Otobashi claps his hands twice, and the room moves. Breakfast is soup. Marco has never had soup in the morning. At home, breakfast was bread and olives, and sometimes a little cheese, eaten standing by the door or walking to the fields, bread stuffed in his pocket. But here the soup is hot and thick and salty, and it is served in a great iron cauldron, a huge black pot with handles that take 2 boys to carry, and the soup is ladled into wooden bowls that are passed from hand to hand. Marco takes his bowl, holds it with both palms, and the warmth of it shocks him a little. He has not realized how cold he is until the warmth comes. He drinks the soup slowly, feeling it travel down his throat and into his chest, and he feels, for the first time since he arrived, something that might be comfort. The room is full of the sounds of drinking, 100 boys sipping hot liquid in the gray half-light, and the sound is soft and rhythmic, like rain on a roof, and Marco drinks, and the morning becomes a little lighter. After breakfast, there is the washing. The Otobashi leads them out of the sleeping room and down a long stone corridor to the bathhouse, and Marco does not know what to expect. He has seen the river at home and the wooden tub his mother used for laundry. He has never seen a bathhouse. He walks into the room and stops, because the room is full of steam, white and thick and warm, and it smells of soap and stone and something green. And at the center of the room is a great basin of water, and around it are smaller basins, and the whole room glows with a pale, foggy light from a row of tiny windows high up in the wall. The boys are told to undress. Marco takes his time, untying his old clothes, folding them the way he has seen the other boys fold theirs. And then he pads barefoot across the warm stone floor, and the steam closes around him like a hand. The water is warm. That is another thing Marco does not expect. The water at home was always cold, even in summer, because the stream ran down from the mountains, and the sun never reached it all the way through the trees. But this water is warm, almost hot, and when Marco steps into the shallow end of the great basin, he feels a sound come out of his mouth that he has never made before, a sound that is half gasp and half sigh, a small noise of pure, involuntary pleasure. The other boys laugh, not unkindly. A boy to his left splashes him gently with a cupped hand. Marco ducks his head under the water, and the world goes soft and muffled, and when he surfaces, the steam is even thicker, and the light is even softer, and he feels something in him begin to slow down, to unclench, to breathe. This is the thing that no one tells you about being taken from your village. It is not all grief. There are these small moments of unexpected gentleness, these little pockets of ease that open up inside the long, hard process of becoming someone else, and they take you by surprise, and they are almost more confusing than the grief itself, because you do not know what to do with them. Marco stands in the warm water, and his skin is clean, and his body is glowing with the steam, and he thinks of his mother, and the thought does not hurt as much as it did last night, and he does not know whether that is a blessing or a betrayal. He stands there in the water, drying himself slowly with a thin towel, and he watches the other boys, the way they move, the way they laugh, the way the older ones help the younger ones, and he begins, in the smallest possible way, to imagine a place for himself among them. The day unfolds slowly. There is training, yes, but not the kind of training Marco had imagined, not with weapons and shields and shouting commanders. That comes later, much later, in the years after the apprenticeship. For now, the training is more like the work of a farm. They are taken out into the courtyard, and they are given tasks. Some of them carry stones from one side of the courtyard to the other. Some of them dig ditches and then fill the ditches back in. Some of them chop wood, and some of them carry water, and some of them run back and forth along the long wall at the edge of the courtyard, lap after lap, their breath clouding in the cold air. The older boys are there to watch, and they call out instructions, and they correct the way Marco holds his arms when he runs, and they show him the trick of carrying a heavy stone close to his body so that it does not pull his shoulders out of place. These are the lessons, the manual lessons, the lessons that a body learns before the mind does. Marco does not know that he is being trained. He only knows that the day is long, and that by the time the sun is high overhead, he is tired in a way that feels clean and good, the tiredness of a body that has been used. and that is a different thing from the tiredness of sorrow. Lunch arrives, and again there is soup, but this time there is also bread, great round flat loaves that arrive in baskets carried by boys even younger than the recruits, boys who are not yet allowed to join the barracks and are serving their time as errand runners, the smallest ones, the ones who will grow into the system over the years. Marco eats the bread in silence, tearing off pieces and dipping them in the soup, and he watches the courtyard around him. There are boys everywhere, in every direction, a whole city of boys, a sea of heads and shoulders and busy hands, and they are all engaged in the same process, the slow, grinding process of turning villages into soldiers, and Marco is one of them now. He is not outside the process anymore. He is inside it. He eats his bread, and he drinks his soup, and the sun warms the back of his neck. And for a moment, just a moment, he is almost content. The afternoon brings more exercise, and then something new. They are taken to a large open shed at the edge of the compound, a building without walls, just a roof held up by wooden pillars. And inside the shed, there are piles of straw, and the boys are told to lie down on the straw, one by one, in a long row. Marco does not understand. He lies down on his back, and the straw crackles beneath him, and he looks up at the underside of the roof, where birds have nested in the rafters. The older boys walk down the row, looking at each recruit as he lies on the straw, and they speak in low voices to each other, and sometimes they stop and kneel and press a hand against a boy's belly or a boy's chest, feeling for something, some internal quality that Marco cannot see. It is a kind of examination, a sorting. The boys who are stronger or more alert are moved to one end of the row. The boys who are weaker are moved to the other. Marco watches the sorting happen and realizes with a small start that he is being sorted, that this is the moment when his new life begins to take a specific shape, and he holds his breath without knowing why. And then a hand presses against his stomach, and a voice says something in a calm, bored tone, and he is moved to the middle. Not at the front, not at the back, the middle. And he lies on the straw, looking up at the rafters, and he feels something that might be relief, and something that might be fear. And the two feelings get mixed up together in his chest and become something he cannot name. The evening is quieter. The boys are herded back to the sleeping room, and for a while there is free time, and Marco does not know what to do with free time, because in his village, free time did not exist, not for children, not in that form. He sits on the edge of his platform with his legs dangling over the side, and he watches the other boys. Some of them are talking in small groups, their heads bent together, their whispers rising and falling. Some of them are playing a game with pebbles, tossing them into a circle scratched into the floor. Some of them are sitting alone, like him, their eyes on nothing, their hands folded in their laps. He looks out the window at the gathering dusk, and the sea is a strip of dark metal between the roofs, and a gull is crying somewhere, a sound thin and lonely, and Marco feels the evening settle over him like a coat. Then the night comes down, and the ceremony of sleeping begins again. The lanterns are lit, then dimmed. The boys find their places on the platforms, unrolling their felts, spreading their blankets. Marco has done this once before, but he is still slow at it, and he watches the boy next to him, the one who had cried in the night, and he copies the movements. The boy does not look at him, but he moves a little slower, a little more deliberately, as if he knows he is being watched and does not mind. They settle into their places. The Odabashi walks the perimeter, checking the windows, checking the doors, checking the lanterns. The room grows quiet. The wind has dropped, and the sea is calm, and there is no sound but the soft shifting of bodies and the occasional cough, and the slow, patient breathing of 100 boys who are trying, one by one, to find the door to sleep. Marco lies on his back, and he looks up at the ceiling, and he is tired enough now that the pain in his heart has gone quiet, dulled, like a tooth that has stopped aching for a while. He does not try to think about his mother. He does not try to think about his village. Instead, he thinks about the day, the small parts of it, the warm water of the bath, the taste of the bread, the feel of the straw beneath his back, the sound of the older boys' voices as they sorted him into the middle. He thinks about the boy next to him, whose name he does not know. He thinks about the soup and how it had been served to 100 boys, and how the taste of it had reminded him of nothing, which was somehow the most comforting thing of all. He closes his eyes, and the red and gold dark comes again, and this time he is not afraid. He is tired, and the tiredness is a blanket thicker than the one he sleeps under, and he lets it cover him. And he sleeps. Perhaps you feel yourself beginning to drift, listening to this. That is all right. That is what this story is for. We are not in a hurry. There is no ending to reach. We are walking through the dark together, and the path is long, and there are many nights ahead of us, and many mornings. But let me tell you a little more, if you can stay awake a little longer, because there are things about this place, this barracks, this strange half-world of sleeping and waking soldiers, that take a while to explain. Here is a thing that the history books do not always tell you. The Janissary barracks were not just a place where soldiers slept. They were the center of the universe for the men who lived in them, a kind of home that was also a country, a family that was also an army. The Janissaries did not live in small rooms or private quarters. They lived together in great communal halls, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, in a way that is almost unimaginable to us now. Barracks were their world, and the world was made up of rooms of Odas, and each Oda was a small nation with its own customs, its own rivalries, its own alliances, its own way of folding a blanket, its own jokes, its own wounds. And the cauldron was the heart of it. This is important. The cauldron, the great black pot that Marco had seen at breakfast, was not just a pot. It was a symbol, a banner, a flag. Each Oda had its own cauldron, and the cauldron was treated with something close to reverence. It was kept clean, polished, handled with care. The men who served the food from the cauldron were not just cooks. They were officers, leaders, the heartbeat of the room. To eat from the cauldron was to belong. To be denied the cauldron was the worst punishment, worse than a beating, worse than time in the stocks. because it meant that you were not a brother anymore, that you had been cut off from the body of the room. And if a Janissary wanted to send a message to the Sultan, what did he do? He turned his cauldron over. He spilled the soup. He tipped the great black pot and let the stew run into the dust. And the whole empire knew that the Janissaries were angry, that something was wrong with the family, that the conversation had broken down. Marco does not know any of this yet. He is a boy, a recruit, and a semi, and the symbols are still invisible to him. He sees the cauldron and thinks of soup. He sees the otabashi and thinks of a man who walks quietly through the dark. He sees the room, the long platforms, the folded blankets, the lantern flames, and he thinks of it as a place where he sleeps, not as a home, not yet. But the room is teaching him, even as he sleeps. The room is teaching him about belonging. It is teaching him about rank, about the subtle hierarchies that govern every human group. The way one boy will always be the one who fetches the water, and another will always be the one who fetches nothing, and another will be the one whose silence everyone respects. These are not lessons that are taught with words. They are taught with the body, with the placement of a sleeping body on a platform, with the number of blankets a boy is allowed, with the distance a boy keeps from the old soldiers, with the way he holds his head when he walks through the courtyard. Marco is learning these lessons without knowing he is learning them. The room is his teacher, and the room is patient, and the room has all night. Let me tell you about the room itself, the broad shape of it. The Janissary barracks in Istanbul, the ones that were built in the years after the great conquests, were not like the small wooden barracks of later centuries. They were vast stone structures, great long halls with high ceilings and rows of windows, built around courtyards the size of village greens. Inside, the sleeping quarters were arranged in long galleries, and the platforms, the sekis, ran along the walls like wide benches. And on those platforms, each recruit had a space about the width of his own body, a space he could mark with his felt pad and his blanket, a space that was his, no matter how many other boys crowded around him. The room could hold hundreds. It could hold thousands. In the great barracks, the old ones, the ones that the travelers wrote about with amazement and dread, there were rooms where the sleeping platforms ran so far into the distance that a boy standing at one end could barely see the lantern at the other end. Just a pinprick of light in a long, dark tunnel of wool and breath. And there were rules. Oh, there were always rules. The boys were not allowed to talk after the lanterns were dimmed. They were not allowed to leave their places except in emergencies. They were not allowed to keep food in their sleeping areas because food brought mice, and mice brought disease, and disease was an enemy more feared than any army. They were not allowed to lie in bed after the morning bell, and they were not allowed to wake before the bell and disturb the others. And there was a fine, a payment in chores, a carrying of a cauldron, or a scrubbing of a floor for any boy who broke the rules. But here is the thing that surprises me, and that would perhaps surprise you too, if you think about it. The rules were not always enforced with violence. The old soldiers, the otobashi and the senior recruits, they had their whips and their sticks, and they used them, yes, but they also had another tool, a more subtle tool, the tool of shame, and the tool of silence, and the tool of small, barely perceptible exclusion. A boy who broke the rules might not be beaten. He might simply be ignored for a day. He might find that no one would sit next to him at dinner, that the spaces around him on the platform remained empty, that he had become, for a few hours or a few days, invisible. And that invisibility was worse than pain. It was a small taste of the unbelonging, the cut, the overturned cauldron, and it was enough to make most boys keep the rules. But the rules were not the whole story. There was also tenderness. This is the part that is hard to explain, and the part that perhaps I should whisper, because it feels almost like a secret. In that great dark room, full of boys who had been taken from their homes, there was tenderness. There was the older boy who taught the younger boy how to fold his blanket, his hands patient over the stubborn wool. There was the boy who had a sweet hidden in his pocket, a piece of dried fruit saved from home, and who shared it with the boy on the platform next to him, pressing it into his hand without a word. There was the boy who cried in the night, and the other boy who slid closer to him, just a little, just the width of a hand, so that their shoulders touched and the crying stopped. There was the small, quiet habit of mending, of a boy sewing a torn sleeve for another boy, of a boy whose hands were steady using them to tie the laces of a boy whose hands were shaking. No history book tells you about these small acts of care, because they are too small to be recorded, too small to matter to the historians, but they mattered in the room. They were the glue that held the whole vast structure together, the mortar between the stones, the warmth in the long cold hours before the dawn. Marco dreams that second night. He dreams of home, but the dream is not sad. He dreams of the stream behind his village, the sound of the water, the cold, soft stones beneath his bare feet. He dreams of his mother's hands, kneading dough, the flour clouds rising in the morning light. He dreams of his father's voice, calling him in from the edge of the field, calling his name across the distance. And in the dream, the distance does not feel like a loss. It feels like a shape, a way of being touched, and Marco answers, and his voice crosses the distance, and his father hears, and the dream holds the moment like a bowl holds water. And then it spills slowly, and the dream changes, and Marco is not dreaming of home anymore. He is dreaming of the room. He is dreaming of the platforms, and the bodies, and the breath. 100 boys lying in the dark like seeds in a pod. He is dreaming of the cauldron, the vast black shape at the center of the world, and the steam rising, and the faces turning toward it. And Marco is one of the faces. And he feels something opening in his chest, a place where a new name might someday live. And he does not know the name, but the dream knows, and the dream holds it for him, waiting. He wakes in the middle of the night, somewhere between the second and third watch, and the room is so quiet he can hear the far-off sound of the sea, and the wind, and the rustle of a body turning over, and he lies there, not afraid, and he listens to the silence. And the silence is full of things he does not yet understand, and the silence is kind. He is learning to sleep. That is the thing that the history books will leave out if you ever read them. They will tell you about the training, the equipment, the battle lines, the sieges, the politics, the daily rhythms of the Janissary Corps. But they will not tell you that one of the first things a recruit had to learn was how to sleep in a room full of strangers. They will not tell you that the body had to adjust to the presence of other bodies, to the sounds of other breaths, to the weight of other expectation. For a boy from a village, from a small house with thin walls and a single hearth, the sudden crush of human closeness could be a shock. It could keep him awake for weeks. The sheer noise of other people, the snoring, the muttering, the shifting of 100 bodies on 100 pads of felt. But the body adapts. It always adapts. And Marco's body was adapting night by night, the way a river adapts to its bed, the way a root adapts to the shape of the stone around it. He was learning to sleep as a soldier sleeps, which is to say, he was learning to sleep at any time, in any place, under any conditions, because he did not know when he would be allowed to sleep again. And sleep was a weapon, a tool, a gift that had to be taken whenever it was offered. By the end of the first week, Marco had a routine. He did not know that it was a routine because it had not been taught to him, not in words, but his body had absorbed it, the way a seedling absorbs light. He woke before the bell now, not because the bell woke him, but because something inside him had begun to count the hours of the dark, and it knew the approach of morning. He folded his blanket the way the boy next to him folded his, the edges tucked sharp, the roll tight, and he felt a small, quiet pride in the neatness of it, a pride he did not confess to anyone. He ate his soup, and he drank his water, and he stood where he was told to stand, and he moved when he was told to move, and the days began to blur into each other, one long, gray, physical present, a present of warm water and rough bread, and the smell of wool and the ache of tired muscles. And he began to make a friend. It happened slowly, as these things do, in the small spaces between the activities, in the lines for the soup, in the walk from the bathhouse to the courtyard, in the quiet half hour after the evening light, and before the lanterns were dimmed. The boy on the next platform, the one who had cried, was named Lazar, and he came from a village that was far away, beyond the mountains, a place of vineyards and olive trees, a place that Marco had never seen. Lazar did not speak much. None of the boys spoke much in those first weeks, because they were still learning each other's languages. Or rather, they were learning the new language, the language of the barracks, which was not Turkish exactly, not the Turkish of the officials, but a kind of barracks Turkish, simple and direct, full of gestures and repetitions, and the names of things: water, bread, sleep, wake, work. Marco and Lazar learned this language together. They learned to say the names of the tools they carried, the stones, the ropes, the baskets. They learned to say the names of the officers, the ones who were kind and the ones who were not. They learned to say, in their halting new language, the small things that needed to be said, the small words of passing bread and sharing water, and they communicated the rest with gestures, with shrugs, with the silent language of boys who are far from home and who have found, against all odds, another boy who understands. There was a night, maybe in the second week, maybe in the third, when Marco could not sleep. It happened sometimes. The exhaustion was not always enough to carry him all the way through the night. He would wake in the small hours, and the sleep would be gone from him, and he would lie in the dark, alone with his thoughts, and the thoughts were not always kind. On this night, the thoughts were about his father. He remembered the day they had come for him, the day the recruiting officer had walked into the village with his papers and his guards, and the way his father had stood at the door of the house, his hands at his sides, not moving, not speaking. Marco had always thought of his father as a man who could fix anything, who could mend a wall or a tool or a broken promise. But on that day, his father had been broken, and Marco had seen it, and the seeing had been a wound. He lay in the dark, and he turned the memory over, and the more he turned it over, the sharper it got. And then there was a small sound, a rustle, a shifting of weight, and Lazar's hand was resting on the edge of Marco's platform, the fingers splayed, the palm up. It was an offering, a question, a gesture that said, "You are not alone," or "I am here," or simply, "I know." Marco did not know what to do with it. He lay there for a long moment, looking at the dark shape of the hand, and then he reached out, and he rested his own hand on Lazar's palm, and the two boys lay in the dark, their hands touching, and they did not speak. And after a while, Marco felt the tears come, not loud tears, not sobbing tears, but the quiet, hopeless tears of a child, and he let them come. And the tears made a channel, a riverbed, and the river ran through him, and it was not cleansing exactly, but it was movement, and movement was better than stillness. And when the tears had passed, Marco was tired, and he closed his eyes, and Lazar's hand was still there, resting under his, and he slept. What is the point of these stories? These small, dark, candlelit stories of boys who were taken from their homes centuries ago. The point is not to make you sad, although you may feel sad, and you may feel the sad in a way that is soft and bearable, the way a sleepy child can hold a difficult emotion and then let it go. The point is to show you that the world is made of these small human moments, even in the places and the times and the institutions that seem most strange and most brutal and most far away. The Janissary Corps was a mighty thing. It was an army, a power, a state within the state, a force that shaped the history of the world for centuries. But it was also, every night, a room full of boys, sleeping on felt, and one of those boys was crying, and another had a hand stretched out in the dark, and the two of them together made a small human bridge, a bridge that crossed the gap between villages and languages and losses. And that bridge is still standing in the stories we tell, if we are quiet enough to find it. So let us be quiet. Let us sit with Marco and Lazar in the dark, in that great stone room by the sea, in the middle of the long 16th century, with the wind moving over the rooftops, and the sea slapping against the walls, and the embers fading in the hearth. Let us not tell the rest of the story, not yet. There is so much more to tell, of course. There are the years of training, the long hardening of the body, the lessons in how to use a bow, how to throw a spear, how to ride a horse, how to stand in a line of men and not run. There are the years of service, the campaigns, the sieges, the battles, the strange and terrible intimacy of men who fight together, who sleep together, who eat together, who die together. There are the days of glory, when the Janissaries marched in their blue and red, their banners bright and their cauldrons polished, and the crowds parted before them, and the sultans feared them and loved them and tried to bind them. There are the days of decline, when the corps swelled and changed, when recruits were sometimes taken not from villages, but from the sons of Janissaries, when the old strictness softened, when the barracks filled with tradesmen, and the discipline frayed, and the cauldrons were overturned too many times. And there is the end, the violence of it, the end of the Janissaries, the toppling of the cauldrons for the last time, the smoke and the fire and the dissolution, the moment when the great sleeping room finally emptied and the platforms were cleared, and the felt pads and the blankets were taken away, and the room was quiet in a way it had never been quiet in all its long history. But that is not a story for tonight. Tonight is a story about sleep. Tonight the boys are still young, and the barracks still stand, and the war is far away, and the day has been long, and the bodies are tired, and the bodies are safe. Marco is sleeping now, truly sleeping, his face turned to the wall, his breath slow and regular. Lazar is sleeping too, his hand no longer stretched out, his arm curled under his head, lost in some dream of vineyards and olive trees and a warm wind off the sea. The Otabashi has made his rounds and is sitting by the door, his head nodding, his lantern low. The night is halfway through its dark, and the barracks are quiet, and the world is at peace, and we can, perhaps, let ourselves drift too. If you are still awake, I want you to take the moment with you. I want you to notice the weight of your covers, the warmth of your pillow, the ordinary, overlooked miracle of your own bed, your own room, your own four walls. I want you to think of Marco and Lazar, sleeping in their long room by the sea, and I want you to know that their sleep was real as the stones and the stars, and that the small tenderness of a boy's hand in the dark was real, and that you are part of a long chain of sleepers, a long line of human creatures who have lain down in the dark, alone and together, and closed their eyes and entrusted themselves to the night. And if you have already drifted off, then you have understood the story better than anyone. Let it go. It will be here when you return, the barracks, the boys, the lanterns, the sea. I will keep it warm for you, the way the felt pads are kept warm by the bodies of the boys, the way the embers are kept warm under the ash, the way a story is kept warm by being told, and told again, and told once more slowly in the dark, in the patient voice of a friend who does not want the night to end. and yet knows that all nights must end, and that the morning will come, and the soup will be hot, and the cauldron will be carried, and the great work of the world will continue in its vast, unbroken, undreamed cycle. But that is not the end. There is always more of the story. There is always another night. So let this be the place where we pause, not finish. Let this be the breath between the sentences, the moment when the lantern flickers and the room holds still, and the boys sleep on, and Marco's chest rises and falls, and the roof beams hold, and the walls hold, and the world holds, and there is nothing to be afraid of, and nothing to be done, and nothing to think, and nothing to remember, and the night is a dark water, and we are floating in it together, at ease, at rest, at last. And yet, the room was not silent. No room full of sleeping bodies ever is. There was the breath of the boys, the manyness of it, a low tide of air moving into chests and out of them. Each boy a small bellows, each breath a sigh or a whistle or a soft clicking at the back of the throat. There was the creak of a platform as somebody turned, the rustle of felt, and the heavier rustle of wool blankets, the far-off hiss of the lantern wick, and under it all the sea, which had been speaking to the walls since long before the barracks were built, and would go on speaking long after the walls had fallen. The sea did not know about the Janissaries. The sea had its own long memory, and it kept it, and it whispered it at night against the stones. A boy near the middle of the room coughed in his sleep, once, twice, and then settled. Another boy murmured something, a word that was not quite a word, a dream sound from a language that no longer had a country, and then he was quiet again. Somewhere in the dark, a man with a sore hip turned over on his platform and let out a long, low groan, and the man beside him, without ever waking, reached out and patted the air until the groaning stopped. There was a kindness in that, the kind of kindness that does not know it is being kind, the automatic kindness of the body, the hand that reaches out before the mind has decided to reach. And the Otobashi, sitting on his low stool by the door, heard all of it the way a shepherd hears the weather. He had been on this watch more nights than he could count. He knew the sound of a boy who was cold, and a boy who was dreaming of home, and a boy who was not really asleep at all, but lying awake with his eyes open and his heart racing. He could have been a shepherd, he sometimes thought. He had grown up on a hillside in what was now a province, and had been, when he was a boy, a cloud of small white sheep and a dog that slept with one eye open. But he had been taken too, and the hillside had grown small and blurred, and now his flock was made of boys, and his knowledge was the knowledge of turning bodies and breathing, and the small sounds that an exhausted child makes in the deepest part of the night. He remembered his own first nights. He had cried so hard and so long that he had made himself sick, and the old sergeant who had been in charge of his Oda had not comforted him and had not scolded him. The sergeant had simply sat beside him, silent, a solid dark shape in the dark room, and after a while the silence had been enough. Nothing had been solved. The boy he had been still wanted his mother and his father, and the kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke, and the olive trees in the rain. But the silence meant someone was there, and that was the beginning of something, although he had not known it then. He let his head nod. The lantern had burned low. There was a boy called Yusuf who had come from a high valley where there was no sea at all. And Yusuf had been put in the second row by the window, and he had lain awake the whole first night, listening to the sound of the water hitting the wall below. He had thought it was a great animal, a giant creature breathing and licking the stones, and he had spent the whole night certain that the animal would grow tired of waiting and would open its mouth and swallow the building whole. But the animal had not. The animal had kept its rhythm, breath after breath, and in the small hours of the morning, when the black of the window had softened a little, Yusuf had felt the strangest thing. The sound had become ordinary, not familiar exactly, but no longer frightening. It was just there, like wind, like snow, like the river outside his village that spoke in a language he had always heard but never understood. He was asleep now, Yusuf, with his knees drawn up and one hand under his cheek, and his breath was a small, steady flute. The sea went on breathing beside him, and if he dreamed in the language of the high valley, of sheep bells and the blue smell of juniper, and his grandmother calling the goats at dusk. The Otobashi could almost see the dream from where he sat, not because he had any power to see into minds, but because he had seen so many boys dream the same dream, the dream of the place that had let them go and would never let them go, the place they would carry folded inside them for the rest of their lives, like a cloth that had once held bread. That is the thing, perhaps, about sleep. It is the place where we let what we cannot understand be next to us. We do not have to make sense of it. The sea does not have to be explained. The barracks do not have to be justified. The boys do not have to be rescued or avenged or turned into symbols. They only have to be allowed to sleep and to dream and to carry their small, folded places. And there is a kind of holiness in that, if holiness is a word that is allowed to sit quietly in a room with you at 3 a.m. I think it is. I think the room by the sea was holy in the way all rooms are holy where exhausted creatures lie down and trust the dark. The stone walls were holy because they held the night out. The roof beams were holy because they took the weight of the world and did not complain. The felt pads were holy because they were soft. And in a world of so many hard things, a little softness, even a felt pad, even a boy's tunic folded under his head, is a sacrament. Perhaps that is too much to say about a barracks. Perhaps it is not. Think of it this way. When you lie down at night and close your eyes, the world does not stop. There are other rooms, other beds, other bodies, other breaths. There is a boy in the next street coughing, and a woman on the floor above turning over, and a man in a truck 2 roads away who has pulled into a lay-by and laid his head on the wheel for 5 minutes because he cannot go on. There is a baby in a far city crying, and an old dog in a farmhouse sighing in its sleep, and a man in a high valley who is not listening to the sea because he has never heard it, and a boy in a great stone room by the water who is listening to it, and finding it has become, by the second night, a kind of friend. All of us, sleeping and waking and half dreaming, lying down or sitting up or leaning against something with our eyes closed. We are all holding the night up together, and the night holds us. The barracks themselves were old by the time Marco and Lazar slept in them. They had been built in the early years of the Corps, when the Janissaries were still new thing in the world, and the walls had seen so many generations of boys that the stone had grown almost smooth in the places where hands and shoulders and heads had rested against it. In some of the rooms you could see the faint marks in the plaster where a boy had scratched his name, or his village, or a word that was only a word. And the Otobashi, who was old enough to read them, would sometimes run his fingers over them the way you might run your fingers over the grain of an old wooden table. There was no point to them, those marks. They were not important, but they were there, and they were a kind of proof, a proof that this boy had slept here, that he had been cold and frightened and tired, and that he had lain awake long enough to find a sharp stone and make a mark. On the first night of every new group of boys, the Otobashi used to tell them a story about the builder who had raised the walls. It was not a true story, or at least nobody could say whether it was true, but he told it anyway, the way you tell a story to young animals to make them feel safe. He said that the old builder had been afraid of the dark. He had spent his whole life building walls and roofs, but at night he could not sleep. And so, when the barracks were finally finished, he had stayed awake all night in the great empty room, listening to the wind and the sea. And in the morning he had gone to the Agha and said, "The building is haunted. It is haunted by all the sleep that has not happened yet." And the Agha, who was a practical man, had said, "Then we will put boys in it, and the boys will fill it with sleep, and the haunting will end." And that had been the beginning of the arrangement. The boys came, and they slept, and the room filled with their breath and their dreams and their small noises. And the old builder went back to his room and slept for the first time in years. He slept badly, of course, because that was who he was, but he slept. He dreamed of walls that were not finished and roofs that leaked stars. And when he woke, he was still tired, but there was a little less weight on his chest. He said later that the weight had not been his own. It had been the building's weight, the weight of all the sleep that had not happened yet, and the boys had taken it from him. Whether or not he actually said that, I cannot tell you. He was a builder, and builders are not always known for their poetry. But the Otobashi told the story so often that it had become smooth, like a stone in a river, and the boys believed it, or half believed it, which is the same thing for the purpose of falling asleep. I imagine the boys believed other things too in those first nights. I imagine they believed the sea had a voice, and that the voice was speaking to them, even if they could not understand the words. I imagine they believed the high ceiling kept them safe, and the long room knew their names without being told. And because I am telling you this story in a quiet hour, I want you to try something. I want you to think of the room where you are lying right now, or sitting, or half dozing. Think of the walls. Think of the ceiling. Think of all the people who have breathed in that room before you. It does not matter if they were strangers. It does not matter if you have never known their names. The room remembers them. It remembers the way they sighed, and the way they turned over, and the small sounds they made when they were not asleep and not awake, but somewhere in between. And the room holds those sounds for you, the way the barracks held the sounds of all those boys. They slept in rows, as I have told you, but the rows were not neat rectangles like the rows of a planted field. They were more like the rows of a village that grows along a road, a little crooked, a little uneven, with some sleeping drawn up and some spread out, and one boy always lying at an angle so that his feet pointed toward the neighbor's pillow. The Otobashi did not correct them. He had learned that sleep will take whatever shape it needs, and a boy who is tangled in a blanket at midnight will be the same boy who lies as straight as a soldier at noon. The body does its own negotiating with the night. All the Otobashi had to do was make sure the felt pads were down, and the windows were not too open, and the lantern was low, and the door was held against the wind. There was a particular thing that happened in the barracks during the deepest part of the night, and I want to describe it to you now, because it is one of those small miracles that nobody writes down and almost everybody forgets. Sometime after the last boy had finished crying, and the sea had settled into its slowest breathing, and the lantern flame had stopped dancing and had grown still and small, the room would begin to hum. It was not a sound they could hear with their ears. It was more like the hum you feel when you lie with your head against a table, and someone far away is tapping a rhythm with a fingertip. It was the hum of many bodies breathing together, many hearts beating in the same dark, the soft friction of wool and felt, and the small movements of dreams. And when the room began to hum, the boys who were still half awake would feel their own breath fall into the rhythm of the room, and their own hearts match the hearts around them. And very soon they would be asleep too, because it is hard to stay awake when the whole building is breathing with you. I have felt something like that in my own life, and perhaps you have too. Perhaps you have lain awake in a house where someone else was sleeping, and you have heard their breath through the wall, and without meaning to, you have slowed your own breath to match theirs. That is the oldest magic there is, older than any fortress, older than any core, older than the sea itself. It is the magic of being near another living thing. It is the magic of the flock, the herd, the family, the barracks. It is the reason we do not sleep alone if we can help it, and why, when we do sleep alone, we sometimes leave the radio on very low, or the television, or the fan, just so there is a voice, just so there is a rhythm, just so the room hums. In the winter, the barracks were cold. I do not mean the kind of cold you feel when you step out of a warm house and the air bites your cheeks. I mean the kind of cold that lives in stone and does not leave, the kind that waits all day for the fire to go out so it can return to the walls and the floor and the felt pads and the blanket. The recruits were given one blanket each, sometimes two if the Otobashi was kind, and they learned all the ways a blanket can be arranged. They learned to fold it around their feet first, then their legs, then their chest, and to tuck the edge under their chin so that their breath made a little warm pocket. They learned to sleep curled like a crescent, with their knees drawn up and their hands tucked between their thighs, which was a position that the older boys laughed at, but also used themselves when it was cold enough. They learned that two boys sleeping side by side were warmer than two boys sleeping at a distance, and that if you were very quiet in your friendship, you could share a blanket without anyone saying anything about it. And the warmth that came from that sharing was a warmth that felt like something more than heat. There was a boy from a village in the mountains, a boy whose name I do not know, but whose story makes me think of all the boys who slept in the cold and dreamed of the warm. He was from a village where the snow lay on the roofs for half the year, and he had thought he knew cold. But the cold of the barracks was different. It was not the cold of the open air, which has a kind of honesty to it, but the cold of a room that has never been quite warm enough, that has held centuries of winter in its stones, and gives it back slowly, like a debt. On his first night, he had lain awake and thought of the house where he had grown up, the little house with the stove in the middle and the sleepers arranged around it. And he had thought that if he could only press his back against that stove, he would be warm forever. But the stove was far away. The stove was his whole life behind him, growing smaller. And he lay in the dark and felt the cold rise through the felt and settle in his bones. I do not know what happened to that boy. He was a recruit like the others, and he would have learned, as they all learned, that the cold loses its teeth if you stop fighting it. He would have learned to relax his shoulders, to let his breath slow, to notice that the boy beside him was warm, and that the warmth was close enough to touch. And perhaps, before morning, he fell asleep. Perhaps he dreamed of the stove, and in the dream, the stove was not in the old house, but in the barracks. A great black stove in the middle of the room, with his sleeping companions arranged around it like stones around a fire. And he was warm, and they were warm, and the snow outside was only a story. Summertime in the barracks was a different matter. Then the cold was gone, and in its place came the heavy pressing dark of a warm night by the sea. The air did not move. The windows, which were kept open in the summer, let in the sound of the water, but not the breeze, and the boys lay in their own sweat, with their blankets pushed to their feet and their tunics rolled up under their heads. The Otobashi allowed the windows to stay open longer, because he knew that a boy who cannot breathe will not sleep, and a boy who cannot sleep will keep the whole room awake with his turning. So the windows were open, and the night came in, and sometimes a moth flew around the lantern, and sometimes a gust of salt air moved through the room like a rumor. The boys who came from the inland villages had never seen the sea before they saw it through the windows of the barracks. They had smelled it first, the strange smell of salt and wet stone and something green and old, and they had not known what to make of it. Some of them were afraid. Some were heavy with a kind of grief, because the sea meant they were far from home, and the farness was so big that it could not be measured in days or miles, but only in the constant breathing of the water. And some, the ones who were very young or very open, were enchanted. They lay awake just to hear the sea. they let it wash over them. And when the sea was calm, they felt calm. And when the sea was rough, they pushed their feet against the felt and pretended they were in a ship. And the room was the ship, and the ship was carrying them somewhere they could not name. I remember reading once, or perhaps I dreamed it, that there is a kind of sleep that is particular to boys who keep the night watch in a time of uncertainty. It is not the deep sleep of a man who has worked all day and fallen into bed. It is not the light sleep of a mother with a newborn child. It is a sleep that hovers, that can be pulled down at any moment, that has one eye and one ear open, and yet it is restful, and it heals, and it lets the boy grow. The Corps understood this. They did not try to make the boys sleep deep. They tried instead to make the room feel like a refuge, a small container of safety in the middle of a world that would ask everything of them in the morning. In the morning, there would be drill, there would be orders, there would be the endless machinery of becoming a soldier. But at night, in the barracks, there was only the room and the breath and the sea. The Otobashi was the keeper of that. He kept the lantern low. He kept the wolves of the world on the other side of the door. And the boys slept, not because they were safe, but because for a few hours the room agreed to pretend that they were. I want to tell you about the last hour of the night, the hour that belongs neither to darkness nor to day. It was the hour when the Otobashi, who had been sitting on his stool for most of the night, would feel the change in the air. The sea would still be breathing, but there would be a lightness in it, a lessening of weight. The black of the window would soften to a deep gray, and then to a blue, and then to something that was almost colorless, and the room would begin to reveal itself. The shapes of the sleeping boys emerging from the dark, the way stones emerge from a receding tide. The lantern had gone out long ago, or had been turned down to a red coal, and the Otobashi could not see the boys clearly, but he did not need to see them. He knew them the way a gardener knows his rose in the dark, by the shape of the stillness, by the way the air moved around them. He would stand up then, slowly, because his knees were not what they had been. He would walk the length of the room, bending over each sleeping boy, checking that the felt was not tangled, that a hand was not blue with cold, that a face was not too pale or a breath too shallow. He was not a doctor. He had no medicines beyond a small box of oils and a little knowledge of old remedies. But there was a thing he could do that no doctor could do. He could stand over a sleeping boy and know, without being told, whether the boy had come to terms with the night. There was a certain relaxation in the shoulders, a certain looseness in the mouth. A boy who had cried himself to sleep cried with his whole body, and his body remembered it even in sleep, the breath catching, the jaw tight. A boy who had made his peace with the room slept differently. He slept the way a dog sleeps, with all his limbs giving way to the floor. The Otobashi watched for that, and when he found it, he was glad, because it meant the boy would survive, not just the night, but the years, and would one day be the one standing over the next row of boys with the same watchful patience. Near the end of the night, the sea would grow very quiet, and the room would grow very still, and for a few minutes, there would be a hush that was almost like prayer. No one was awake to hear it, or almost no one, because the Otobashi would be sitting on his stool with his eyes closed and his hands folded, and he would be listening to the hush the way you listen to the last note of a song. It was not a sad note. It was not a happy note. It was the note that says the song is nearly over and the next song has not yet begun. And then, from outside, from the wall by the sea, from the city that was beginning to stir in the first gray light, there would come a sound. It might be the call to prayer, or the crowing of a rooster that had lost track of time, or the grind of a cartwheel on the stones. And the hush would break gently like a bubble, and the boys would begin to stir. They never woke at the same moment. There was always one boy who came up from sleep fast, as if he had been waiting for the signal all night. There was always one boy who had to be shaken, or spoken to twice, or touched on the shoulder before his eyes would open. There was always one boy who woke with a gasp, as if he had been falling. The first boy would stand, still half in his dream, and pull his tunic over his head. The second boy would groan and roll onto his back and stare at the ceiling without seeing it. The third boy would sit up slowly, with his hands in his lap, and wait for the feeling to come back to his fingers. And the Otobashi would move among them, not hurrying them, because the morning was already waiting and would wait a little longer. They would roll their felt pads and stack them against the wall. They would shake out their blankets and fold them, poorly at first, then better, then with the crisp efficiency of boys who had done it 1,000 times. The room would fill with the sound of feet on stone and the low murmur of voices. Boys asking each other if they had slept. Boys telling each other about their dreams. Boys who had dreamed of home and boys who had dreamed of the sea. The windows would be opened wider, and the salt air would come in, and the smell of bread would come in from somewhere, and the barracks would become again a building full of boys, not just a container of sleep. But I think, if the walls could speak, they would tell you that their favoritist hour was the one just before this, when the boys were all still asleep, and the sea was quiet, and the Otobashi was sitting with his eyes closed. That was the hour when the room was truly itself. That was the hour when the building was not a barracks, not a prison, not a school, not a home, but something in between, a place where young creatures were allowed to be nothing but young creatures, held in the dark, growing in their sleep. And now, listener, the hour has grown quiet for you as well. The night is deep, or the morning is near, or the afternoon has turned into one of those drowsy hours when the whole world seems to be lying down with its eyes half closed. Wherever you are, whatever room you are in, I want you to let yourself feel a little of what the barracks felt. The weight of the ceiling above you, the softness of the surface beneath you, the air moving slowly in and out of your lungs. You do not have to be a soldier. You do not have to be brave. You only have to be here in this moment, with the night or the day holding you as gently as it can. The boys in the barracks would have understood you. The boy who cried for his mother would have understood you. The boy from the mountain village who dreamed of the stove would have understood you. And the old Otobashi, sitting on his stool by the door, with his knees aching and his hands folded, would have understood you too. He would have nodded slowly, the way he nodded at the boys who had finally fallen asleep. And he would have let you stay in the room and keep the night, and sleep or not sleep as you needed. So rest. Rest the way Marco rested, the way Lazar rested, the way Yusuf rested beside the sound of the sea until it became a friend. The night is wide enough for all of us. There is room in it for your folded places, your small sorrows, your untidy dreams. Lie down or sit still, or lean your head against something soft. Let the room hold you. Let the walls hold the night out. Let the sea breathe, or the road breathe, or the silence breathe, whatever sound is near you. And know that somewhere in a building by the water long ago, a boy was learning to do the same thing. He learned. They all learned. And you will learn too in your own time, because this is what sleep is, and what it has always been. Not a forgetting, not a giving up, a returning, a laying down of the carried weight, a letting the room hold what your hands have been holding. The boys did it every night in their rows by the window, and they did not know that they were teaching the walls the oldest lesson there is. The walls remember it, and I am passing it to you now. Breathe in and breathe out. There is nothing to solve in the dark. There is no task to finish, no duty to answer, no name to make for yourself. There is only this, the quiet, the simple animal grace of being alive and lying still. The Odabashi would approve. He would sit on his stool, and he would nod, and he would let the morning wait. So let it wait. Let all of it wait. The barrack days are over. The boys are gone, every one of them gone, carried away by the centuries, asleep in their own quiet rooms, under their own quiet hills. But the night they taught each other is still here. It is in the way the dark softens at the edges. It is in the way your breath begins to slow, without you asking it to. It is in the small warmth gathering under the blanket, or the fold of your arm, or the cushion under your head. It is here in this story, which I have told you as softly as I can, the way you might tell a story to a sleeping child, or to a friend who has had a long day and needs to let go of it. The lantern is low. The sea is quiet. The door is closed against the wind. And you, listener, are safe. So sleep if you can. And if you cannot sleep, just rest and rest and rest until the room itself takes the weight from you and you float a little, the way a boy floats in the dark of a great stone room by the water, holding his small folded place in his dreaming hands. Good night.